Hi, and welcome to the CFO Mindset. I'm Quentin Purtzer.
Then I'm Nick Kirby.
And today we're joined by Jon Blair, the founder of Grow CFO. Hey, Jon.
What's happening, guys?
So, Jon, Grow CFO, you founded this about a year ago. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and maybe a little about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of the condensed version is, prior to founding Grow CFO, I come from the brand side of the world. Graduated from a place in California business school called Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Instead of going the traditional Big Four accounting route, I immediately went into the entrepreneurial world and started working as like head of accounting, head of finance for very early stage entrepreneurial businesses. And that's where the entrepreneurial bug and early stage high growth got kind of planted into my blood, and went on for the next several years to work for several different early stage high growth companies, and then ended up landing about 6 years or so ago at a company called Guardian Bikes, which you may have seen featured on ABC Shark Tank. We were a Mark Cuban company. Actually was founded by two of my business school colleagues. I had been with the company actually as a moonlighting accountant since day one, 12 years ago when they launched it out of business school, but was just part-time working nights and evenings. And once the company went on Shark Tank, I came on board full-time. And at that point, we launched Guardian Bikes as a direct-to-consumer e-commerce brand selling the safest kids' bikes direct to your door. I served the company as COO and CFO. And so I handled all aspects of supply chain, inventory planning, purchasing, fulfillment, but then also on the finance side of the house, accounting, financial projections, debt and equity fundraising. And so over the course of 3 or 4 short years, we scaled that business from pre-revenue to healthy 8 figures and grew the team from the 3 of us on the founding team to 20 plus in the midst of COVID-19. And so during that time, I developed a playbook on the finance side of the house. Like, how do you scale such a fast growing, capital intensive consumer goods brand with an e-commerce focus? And towards the end of 2021, I really was starting to get to the itch to move on to the next chapter of my career. And I realized that I really had a heart for that earlier stage, right? Partnering with the visionary leaning founder CEO and kind of being their right hand from a finance perspective to help them navigate all the really difficult decisions that you have to make as you're scaling fast a capital intensive business, right? And so I decided to found Grow CFO at the beginning of 2022. We're fractional CFOs for growing direct to consumer brands. And what we do is we provide the CFO advice and expertise that brand founders need to scale their D2C brand alongside healthy profit, cash flow, and confidence, but without the price tag of hiring a full-time CFO. So that's a little bit about me and how I got here.
That's really cool. And I can see why there's a large need for that in the market. Why don't you talk about the market fit that you're seeing, and why are you able to add such value to these fast growing companies?
Yeah. So to be quite honest with you, I started doing this out of a labor of love, and I actually didn't realize how big of an opportunity there was, and quickly realized how big of a gap there is out there, especially in the fractional CFO world, in terms of CFOs who really are adept at the understanding how to support the earlier fast growth stage in a direct to consumer context. And here's the reality of the problem that we solve. Founders of fast growing businesses need a CFO before they can afford one full time, right? Their bookkeeper and their accountant, their CPA, they're not CFOs. And I always draw this distinction. Accountants, bookkeepers, CPAs, they're absolutely needed, but they're looking in the past. They're looking at what already happened, right? CFOs are looking to the future. What could happen? What is going to happen? How can we make that happen, right? And so what I started seeing in the marketplace is that there are these growing CPG brands that they've got a bookkeeper and accountant, but they start outgrowing the ability for that person to help them make decisions and ultimately achieve their goals that are ahead of them, that are in the future, right? And so what I've found is that once a consumer goods brand reaches somewhere around like 5 million or so in revenue, 5 million in revenue, they do not have the they don't have the margin dollars to support, you know, $20,000 or $30,000 a month CFO, but they absolutely need something more than what their bookkeeper is able to provide in terms of like financial insights, financial planning, and decision-making support, right? And so that's where we come in. We come in and work with brands that are doing 5+ million in revenue, that are growing, that are D2C focused, and we bring in the ability to analyze and plan and make decisions about the future as opposed to the past.
That makes sense, especially as you're hitting that scale. There becomes a lot of levers that need to be pulled, or you need to discuss which ones should be pulled first. Can you walk us through a little bit more in detail? What are some of the hurdles that your clients are running into? And, or I guess, when do you step into working with these companies to make sure that they're making the right decisions?
You know what? It's funny because there's actually a pretty tight overlap with lenders like Flexport Capital, like the timing with which a brand needs to start talking to lenders is that when you're scaling a capital intensive business like a D2C brand, it's capital intensive because it's inventory based, right? So as you're growing, you're constantly having to buy more and more inventory to keep up with the growth. What happens is that cash flow really starts diverging from P&L profitability, right? And in the earlier days, it's a lot easier to keep tabs of cash flow by just using a P&L. But as you really start scaling an inventory-based business, cash flow and P&L profitability start diverging, and founders start going like, "Ugh, I don't understand why I'm making this much money on the P&L, but I don't have any cash in the bank," right? Or why the cash in the bank is so much different than what my P&L says. And so what ends up happening is they start getting really nervous about making decisions. Their team comes to them and says like, "Hey boss, I need to purchase this much inventory to hit our Q4 sales goals." And they know they need that much inventory to hit their Q4 sales goals, but they're like, "I'm not sure if I can afford to do this," right? And so that in comes the entry point where like so many of my clients are, "Hey, it's realize it's time to start looking for a fractional CFO," because they start hesitating on making growth decisions because they can't understand anymore the cash flow impact versus the profitability impact of making those decisions. So that's the first one. And the second one, it's closely related, but it's looking less at the inventory piece and looking at the marketing spend piece of scaling, is they don't understand anymore, or they're not confident in making decisions to scale up advertising spend because, again, they've lost that forward-looking visibility. They're nervous about how that's going to affect cash and their margins, and they go to hire a fractional CFO like us, where we focus in e-commerce direct to consumer, and they're like, "Hey, I need a CFO who can help me understand if I can scale ad spend and hit my margin and cash flow goals at the same time."
Right. It's always balancing, right? Where do you invest those dollars to get the highest return? That's where you get to step in and really make a difference.
Exactly.
Maybe you can take 2 minutes here to explain that difference between the cash flow and the P&L. So a company that's profitable doesn't always have cash in the bank. Can you explain why that happens in a capital intensive business?
100%. This is one of my favorite things. And in fact, shameless plug, we have a cash flow course that we just recently launched, and it's geared towards founders. It's not built out at like a really detailed accounting finance level. We get rid of all the jargon. We don't call things DSO and DIO. We call them by terms that make sense in a business context. But here's the reality. Cash flow is driven by profitability, and I like to say plus or minus the impact of what's called your cash conversion cycle, right? And the cash conversion cycle is driven by inventory days, AR days, and AP days. And like in its simplest form, the more inventory days you have, the less cash you have, because you have that much more inventory sitting in the warehouse. The more AR days you have, the longer it takes you to collect your receivables, so that cash is in your customer's bank account and not yours. And the lower the AP days you have, the more cash is sitting in your vendors' bank accounts instead of your own. And so you can have, say, $100,000 of profitability sitting on your P&L, but if your inventory days are too high and your AR days are too high and your AP days are too low, that $100,000 will be either in sitting on warehouse shelves, sitting in your customers' bank accounts, or sitting in your vendors' bank accounts. That's basically the difference between profit and cash flow.
It makes a ton of sense. And so I assume on your day-to-days, in addition to talking about ramping marketing spend, you're working very closely with founders of D2C brands on managing that cash conversion cycle. Is that accurate? How do you spend your day-to-days with these founders?
Yeah, so I'll answer both of those questions slightly separately, but then kind of connect them. So cash conversion cycle is probably the most common thing that I talk about with the brands that I work with, especially at the beginning of working together, because they usually don't understand it, or they understand it at a very fundamental level. And even if they do understand it, they're not measuring it, right? And so like one thing, part of our service offering is we've built out some visual dashboards of the cash conversion cycle, and they plug straight into your QuickBooks account. And so when someone starts working with us, we plug our dashboards in, and you can actually see a trailing 12-month time series graph of your cash conversion cycle and what goes into that, your inventory days, your AR days, your AP days. And so we have a lot of conversations around the trends of the drivers of the cash conversion cycle. And we spend a lot of time on that with brands, because if you just get focused on margins, which is really important, but if you just get focused on margins, you can completely take your eye off the fact that inventory is getting out of control or AR is getting out of control, and not realize it until there's no cash in the bank. And at that point, it's too late. So that's kind of the answer to your first question. The second question, how do I spend my days with the brands that we work with? With the playbook that I developed, scaling Guardian Bikes, it really boils down to just like a few tools that we that we build, are constantly analyzing and updating and having conversations around. So it's the financial statement dashboards that we build and connect to our clients' QuickBooks. And what those do is they give us a visual representation. That's what's really important, like a visual representation of the trends of your contribution margins and your cash conversion cycle. And with those two things, we can do a lot with guiding brands in the right direction. The second thing is 3-statement financial projection. So when I say 3-statement, we're not just projecting a P&L, we're projecting a balance sheet and a cash flow statement. And we're doing that every single month. And we're analyzing that against our actuals, and we're modeling what the founders and other people on the leadership team of these brands want to potentially do. We're modeling decisions they could make, and then coming back to them and saying, hey, we modeled this out and we could do this, but to do this, again, shameless plug for Flexport Capital, to do this, we need to get some debt financing. And this would be the perfect kind of solution, or Flexport Capital would be the perfect solution for this need, right? So 3-statement financial modeling. And then the third thing is a weekly CFO strategy call. So like we deliver the dashboards, we deliver the 3-statement projections, but then we have weekly calls with our clients where the rubber hits the road of us working together. And we're really like, we are not just analyzing together what we're seeing in those other tools, but we're letting them come to us and say, hey, John, we want to scale ad spend, or we want to hire this person, or we want to go a little heavier on inventory for this strategic reason. And we can plug it into our model, and we can answer questions about how risky that decision is or isn't. And if there's a cash gap, do we as CFOs have a solution to close that cash gap? And then just recently we launched accounting services, and it's because it's just an obvious extension of the CFO pieces that we found that, we're really good at e-commerce accounting because we've done it for so long. And a lot of bookkeepers, there are a lot of nuances to e-commerce and CPG accounting. And so we recently added that on in the last month or so. We added on an accounting services arm because it is the foundation that gives us the kind of core data that we need to build out these models.
Jon, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about common pitfalls. I live in Austin, you live in Austin, and part of what makes Austin great is a startup ecosystem that is really vibrant, actually. So I've worked with a lot of direct-to-consumer brands, and I would see common pitfalls all the time. I'll give you one example of a founder who is really focused on engineering the best next whatever it is, right? And they want to bring in some funding, so they put it on Indiegogo or Kickstarter.
Yep.
And promise free shipping to the world, and they take in a whole bunch of cash. Great, now we can go produce our next best thing.
Mm-hmm.
But just even in promising free shipping around the world, that one small aspect, I don't think a lot of founders, I found that as a common pitfall, didn't think through the entire cash flow and how that would impact future orders and inventory and everything else. That was one example that I've encountered with direct-to-consumer brands. Can you talk a little bit about common pitfalls that you have seen across direct-to-consumer?
100%. The first one is having a SKU catalog that's way too massive. Always introducing new products and not doing so more strategically. And so what happens is their days inventory on hand explodes because they have so many SKUs that they have to keep a minimum inventory level of. And in reality, the 80-20 rule applies. Only 20% of those SKUs are driving most of their revenue and margin dollars. So they got this 80% just sitting there that cash is locked up in. And so having a SKU catalog that's too big for their sales velocity is a very common pitfall I see. Another one that's very specific to the direct-to-consumer world is thinking that ads that perform well are going to perform well on an evergreen basis. And that's just not the case. And that's not even the case in a outside of the e-commerce context. Like ad fatigue is a real thing, right? And so you have to overcome that pitfall. The ones that are really good at understand this, they're always testing new ad content because they know at some point something that's performing really well is going to experience ad fatigue and die off. Those are two very common ones. I'd say the other very common one, and this is like front and center, like kind of in the news and in just given the market conditions over the last 12 months, is that like there's this pitfall that like if we raise enough money, it will buy us enough time to figure out how to create a business that earns above average profit and cash flow, which will ultimately lead to a nice exit valuation. And the reality is that like a business exists to be profitable, to generate profit and generate cash flow. That's what differentiates it from an expensive hobby, right? That's like the definition of a business. And the reality is if you want it to get purchased, you get it purchased in large part based on the fact that there's a sustainable competitive advantage that drives sustainable above average profitability and cash flow, right? Certainly there's opportunities to get your business acquired for like a strategic reason, right? To get bolted onto another company. But if you create a business that is actually has competitive advantages in the marketplace that generates above average profitability and cash flow, someone's going to want to buy it at some point. And there's this pitfall of thinking like, we'll figure it out later and we'll raise money in the meantime and hopefully stumble upon that strategy instead of always thinking with that mindset from day one.
The first one that you mentioned was too many SKUs. Why is that a common pitfall, and what do you help to do to overcome that?
You know what? So it's funny. I would say very consistently, it tends to be a common pitfall because of a founder who is a product visionary, right? And is like, he or she is very product focused and was from the very beginning. They're usually leading product development and have during the whole life cycle of the business. And so as they start approaching scale, they think that always launching like a high volume of new products is the way to achieve scale, because that's the way that they've always known, right? Like in the earlier days. And in reality, it actually comes down more to understanding your customer and the overall journey that they're on with you and the problem that you solve, because there's a way to be strategic about product launches. I'm not saying to not launch products. I'm saying to be strategic about product launches instead of launching products for the sake of launching products, because that's what we've always done, right? And so the way to think about this strategically, the ones that I see really succeed are like, how does this product enhance lifetime value of my existing customer base, right? Like how can I extend onto purchases that my existing customers are already making and get them to buy more, right? Because if we're just always extending new products into brand new customers, if you're always relying on brand new customer acquisition, that's really expensive and it shows up in your margins as you scale. You do have to always acquire new customers, but you need to have healthy enough repeat purchases to offset how expensive it is to bring in brand new customers. And one of the big ways you do that is you launch products that are connected to increasing repeat purchases of existing products and thus increasing lifetime value. I'll give you a good example. So at Guardian Bikes, we started with a 20-inch bike and a 24-inch bike. That's kids roughly from like 5 to call it 9, right? The next product that we launched after that was a 16-inch bike. And we did that because now we can capture a kid a year and a half earlier. And so now they could buy a 16 and a 20 and a 24, thus increasing their lifetime value. And then the next thing we did was, let's go balance bike, right? So now we can get that kid another 6 to 8 months earlier. So now they buy a balance bike and then a 16-inch bike and then a 20-inch and then a 24. And then after that, we launched a 16. So now if you get someone early enough, they could buy 5 bikes from us, right? And how profitable is that, right? And then it was like, okay, well, how do we add on helmets to upsell helmets on that initial purchase that they make from us, right? And knee pads and elbow pads. And where do we insert that into the sales journey to try to get, they were already going to buy a bike. How do we get them to add a little bit more on that single purchase that they were going to make, right? So how I help brands, first off, is just identifying that they have this problem. It almost always comes up in our cash conversion cycle dashboard. We can see the cash conversion cycle keeps going up. It's like, 6 to 7 months long, which is way too long. And I double click into the drivers and they have 6 months of inventory on hand, right? And so the first thing I say is, hey guys, let's calculate inventory days at a SKU level, right? And we start calculating inventory days at a SKU level, and lo and behold, there's 50% of their inventory just sits there and doesn't even move, right? And so I actually have a brand that I started working with a year ago. We did this exact analysis, and they actually chose to discontinue that 50% of SKUs because they're like, we literally sell almost none of these, and we're going to now double down on the SKUs that do sell. And the next time we go launch a product, we're going to think about how to get more order dollars in orders that are already happening from existing customers.
Love it. That's brilliant. So I'm going to back into a couple of things here, heading towards coming back to your playbook, because I have a feeling that you have a lot to say there. But before we get there, let's just back up into fractional CFO. If I'm a brand new person coming out of college and I have a career goal to be a CFO, and I work my way up and eventually get my first CFO job, I'm drawing really on education and experience from previous jobs. Mm-hmm. And if I get that one CFO job, my experience is that one CFO job. You, on the other hand, as a fractional CFO, have now seen 12, let's say, different instances of what works and what doesn't. Can you talk to us a little bit about why fractional CFO is an advantage for you and allows you more view into, more situations?
Absolutely. You laid that out perfectly. Here's the thing. At some point, if you reach a certain size, certain complexity, you do need someone full-time in that seat because there's such a high volume of things to do, right? But for quite a bit longer than a lot of brands realize. Rough numbers like 5 to, especially if you're direct to consumer and you're not manufacturing the goods yourself, like 5 to 30 million in revenue. Fractional oftentimes ends up being the better way to go if you choose the right fractional CFO, especially one that specializes in your industry, like you're referring to. Here's the thing about our CFOs: we're working with almost exclusively growing e-commerce brands every single day. And so we have pattern recognition. We have pattern recognition not just from like our past, but we have almost kind of real-time pattern recognition of seeing what's happening in the marketplace. Here's a really great example. Advertising costs, right? Like I'll give you a real world example, redacting the names of the people that I'm working with, but I have a couple clients who say, hey, Facebook advertising doesn't work anymore. And I'm like, it does, because I have a brand that's spending $1.5 million a month on Facebook and they are killing it. The difference between your Facebook advertising not working and this brand's working is that they have a creative flywheel where they're always cranking out new ad content and they're always testing it and they're always ripping away what's not working and adding in what is working and scaling it up. We have evergreen ads that have been there for 18 months, right? That's the difference. And so even though I'm not a marketing expert, because I'm working with a brand that their Facebook advertising is really working, I can come to the other brands in my portfolio who think that it's not working and say, I have empirical evidence that it's working. I'm not going to lead the growth marketing efforts, but I can tell you generally, here's what these guys are doing. And sometimes my clients, oftentimes, are willing to connect with one another and give each other advice. And so we have kind of like real-time view into trends in the marketplace. And I think another thing that's really helpful, this is helpful for me as the CFO and absolutely for our brands, is that I see a lot of brands that are struggling with the same problem at the same time. And one of them has figured out a solution. I can share in general terms the solution to that problem, right? And also too, like, all direct-to-consumer brands have a very similar, they may not have the same number of days in their cash cycle, but the structure of their cash cycle is the same. If I've got one brand that Flexport Capital is working really well for, as soon as I have another brand that reaches the same problem, like I've got a blueprint of a debt facility that I know is going to work really, really well for them. So that's the other thing, is our network, whether you're talking about lenders or marketing agencies or, you name it, all of us CFOs, at Free to Grow CFO have pretty solid networks in the D2C space. So we can get our clients connected with other adjacent service providers to help them solve needs that we can't solve. But it's like, hey, you're having this problem. Listen, this agency is crushing it for our other client over here. You should go talk to them.
Jon, that's great. I really appreciate the deep dive into that. I think the follow-up question that we all want to hear here is, what are the patterns you're seeing? You say there's a lot of pattern recognition that is consistent among your clients. What are they? So
let's talk a little bit first on I think probably the marketing and sales side of things, because I think from my observations, that's what everyone is really the most concerned about in the consumer goods world. Is like, is demand softening? Is it not? Is it going to? What does that mean for our business, right? And like, I'm not seeing any super clear signs yet of like widespread consumer demand dropping. It doesn't mean that it's not on the horizon, but I'm not seeing it like it's definitive this is happening. Keep in mind, what I am seeing is whether demand is softening or not, the brands that are really good at marketing are still outperforming the ones that are not very good at marketing, right? And the ones that are good at marketing, they're asking themselves questions like, how is my consumer changing in this environment? Or how do we think they're going to change in this environment? And do we need to consider how we need to change, given that that we think that they're going to be changing, or we see that they're going to be changing, right? So in summary, certainly we're not in the demand could be softening. I'm not seeing it super clear. So it hasn't been like significant, but we're definitely not in the the COVID e-commerce heyday of, whatever, 18 months ago, where all you had to do was have a pulse and some inventory and the Shopify store, and you could become a millionaire. So we're definitely not there. In terms of other trends, I will say that like the labor market still is pretty tight, but I have seen it soften for sure compared to like 6 to 12 months ago. 6 to 12 months ago, like all my clients were like, dude, I don't think, like, we cannot negotiate this salary. Like, we have no negotiating leverage. This person's super rock solid. They have all these other offers, right? The leverage seems to be swinging back towards the company slowly, not super fast, but slowly. And there seems to be more talent, easier to acquire new talent for my clients. And then I would say in terms of like costs, right? Like supply chain costs and things of that nature. As you guys are well aware of, freight costs have come down massively on the the inbound side, which is amazing because we were paying $25,000 a container, seems like not that long ago, and we're in a lot better of a place now, like a quarter of that, which has been great. And supply chain capacity for our clients is absolutely freed up, and like we're not seeing capacity constraints. And we actually have been able to negotiate some cost decreases with several of our vendors, which were not, obviously that's commensurate with volume increase, right? Like some of the clients that are growing and have the leverage, right? No one's just handing those out for sure. But we're also getting hit with operating cost increases, left and right, all across the board. So there's a lot of conversation. I'd say most of my clients, if not all of them, are talking about whether or not they should raise their prices. If they do raise their prices, what does that mean? What does that mean given demand could be softening, but like also understanding that like their margins have been under pressure for a long time now, in the since COVID. And so those are some of the big things that I'm seeing.
It makes sense. Yeah. So sales isn't necessarily softening, at least with the clients that you're working with, and marketing continues to be a differentiator. Labor's easier to get. That's a big win. Supply chain costs are coming down. Obviously, a huge win. I know Nick can speak to that in more detail as well. We're seeing freight containers drop as much as 90% year over year right now. So there's a really good opportunity to improve gross margin if you can continue to sell. I guess all that being said, you're seeing these patterns. You've mentioned you've got a playbook that works really well. Do you want to talk just a little bit about that on how you're really walking your clients through end to end on improving everything about their business as you partner with them? Yeah.
So, I mean, here's the thing about growth when we talk about financial planning. Growth is all about balancing. It's all about a balancing act, right? Because the faster you grow, the harder it is to maintain profitability. The faster you grow, the more cash that gets sucked up, right? Also, the faster you grow, the more leverage you have with your vendors to possibly get per unit costs down, right? Like there's a balance and a trade-off across the board, right? And so when we use our playbook is monthly rolling financial projections. So, yes, we set goals for the year, but we roll our projections every month with the latest information that we have. And that the old school, like 12-month static budget is a thing of the past, especially in a fast growing e-commerce world. Our model always looks 24 months ahead. We're placing a lot more emphasis the closer that we get today, right? But like it's always 24 months ahead. And we're looking at not just profitability through the contribution margin lens, but we're also looking at cash flow. And we're constantly asking ourselves, like, we're balancing the achievement of the company's goals with the profitability and cash flow of the business. And so sometimes we'll sacrifice some profitability for the achievement of some goal that we're investing in, right? But additionally, when it comes back to our playbook and we think about how we're helping clients, we're always looking at downside risk scenarios. We're looking at like, look, here's the target, like if everything goes well, right? Here's what we call our baseline, which is like, this is kind of what statistical trends support. And then here's if like the wheels fall off, right? And so what we're always doing, we're kind of looking at those three scenarios and going like, this is the trend, this is our baseline, here's our big home run, here's the downside. If the downside happens, will we survive if we invest in the upside, right? Like if we buy enough inventory to hit our Q4 sales target, but we see a downside sales scenario, will we go out of business? Or, and what we may see is like, you know what? No, we will be okay. But you know what will help us survive that? The right inventory financing. So it's June. Let's go get inventory financing in place because our inventory is not perishable. It's not obsolete. If we miss our numbers for Q4, we're still going to sell this inventory, right? And we have it financed with the right underlying line of credit. We'll right size our inventory levels and we will sell through it. We'll adjust our purchase orders and we'll get inventory days back under control. Like that's a perfect scenario of how we use our playbook to walk our clients through decisions. And it all comes back to the classic finance principle of like risk adjusted decision making, right? That's growing a business is just a series of risk adjusted bets. It's that plus removing bottlenecks. And so we're always going like, hey, let's place this bet, but can we live with the max downside? Kind of like a day trader. A good day trader puts stop limits, right? Like they place a bet, but if they're wrong, they're going to get stopped out and they're going to sell at like a maximum loss, right? And so they're going to live to fight another day. We think about it the same way, but through the lens of financial projections and placing risk-adjusted bets to try to scale a business.
Loving this conversation, Jon. I mean, honestly, you just have so much to offer. It's really, really great. I've got some questions. So tell you what, I wanted to get into some questions that were just a little less formal. But before that, perhaps there are some unconsidered questions. Are there questions that we should be asking that we haven't so far, or that you're hearing from founders?
That's a good question. I honestly, and I don't know how much that you guys have gotten into this in like any other discussions that you guys have had in the past, but honestly, Quentin and I were talking about this when you jumped on, Nick, and this is something I'm really passionate about is like getting the word out there that like these revenue-based financing products are like, they're so ridiculously expensive and all these D2C founders think that they're cheap. And it's like, it drives me crazy because like, they get sold this small fixed fee, seemingly small, 6%, right? And they don't realize that like they get an advance and they only have that money most of the time for the first day that they get that advance. And then they never have that amount of capital at play from that point forward. And because of that fixed fee divided by the average balance of capital that's actually put to work, the annualized rate goes from 6% of that perceived fixed fee to like 20, 30, 40%. And like, I just want people to understand that because it's just, there's so many other products out there, that you can use that don't have that and that actually match the cash cycle better. Like, look at what Flexport Capital is doing. If I don't have payment terms or my payment terms aren't long enough, my cash gap is I got to pay for the inventory before it gets to my warehouse. And so here comes a product that finances that exact gap, right? And so I just want more founders to understand that because it feels like highway robbery to me.
That's interesting and appreciate the plug there, right? Flexport Capital, we do work with D2C brands where we will pay suppliers invoices on their due dates and extend them out 90 and out even to 120 days to better match revenue with expenses. And we work with some of Jon's companies that he is a fractional CFO for. But looking back at those revenue-based loans, a lot of people say they are giving a certain advantage to a founder, right? They're giving cash up front. You're saying that's not the case. Why not?
So here's the thing. And I alluded to this in my most recent newsletter last week. The sales pitch is this small flat fee, right? Which looks small because like if you think about like market interest rates for non-bank lending, depends on where you go, but let's call it 14 to 19% annualized all in, right? A lot of founders know that. And along comes, unnamed revenue-based financing guys, and they say, oh, 6%, right? And so that feels really low, especially when you're like, what can you get in like a treasury bills money market fund right now? Like, man, I'm getting like such a killer deal, right? But then the second part of the pitch is like, hey, all you got to do is plug in your accounts to this app and you'll get underwritten like in the next like 15 minutes, and it's fully non-dilutive. You don't have to raise equity anymore. So it's like, oh, it's non-dilutive. You don't have to raise equity. It's only a 6% fee. And underwriting is a piece of cake, right? And so where they're winning out is it's like they don't need projections. They don't need, their financials could quite honestly not even be up to date and be kind of like a mess in terms of the bookkeeping. And here's someone who will underwrite a loan that is being sold as non-dilutive, which it is non-dilutive, but I'm wondering if the cost of capital for equity is less than 40% for some of these brands. I think it might be. And so on the front, like it's the perception is that like, this is great, but like you're saying, like they're giving you money up front. They are giving you money up front, but if you're paying it back every single day and you don't get to take another advance until you've paid that thing off, if I get $100,000 today and I'm paying back, $3,000 a day. Day one, I have 100, and then I have 97, and then I have 94, and then I have 91, and then I have 88. And so I have less and less capital put to work in my business every single day. Whereas like if I use a Flexport capital, I make $100,000 advance to pay my vendor. That $100,000 is put to work the whole time until I pay Flexport capital back. So I have far more capital at work in my business, funding my growth than I do when I'm paying it back on a daily basis. And even worse, here's the kicker for growing businesses that founders don't think about. These revenue financing products, they're underwritten based on historical sales trends. So when they come up with the percentage of daily remittance that you pay back to them, it's based on previous history, and they forecast how long they think it's going to take to pay them back. But if I'm growing gangbusters fast, I'm actually going to pay it back faster than their financial model. I've never had their model kick back a payback percentage that made sense for a growing brand. And so I end up paying it back even faster than their model has. And so now my effective interest rate goes from 25 to 45% because I paid that dang thing back in like 30 days instead of what they're claiming was going to take 60 days. So it just doesn't work for growing brands.
Right. And it's the first thing that gets paid back, right? You have revenue that hits your bank account. And before it does, those merchant cash advance programs will step in and they will take their remittance amount, whether that's 30% of that daily sale, or whatever X percent that may be. And it really constricts. And so I assume when you were working with those clients, it actually hinders your ability to help them grow because that the first 30% of every daily sale that they see goes back to paying off this loan as opposed to actually investing in higher returning opportunities.
100%. I will tell you that before I moved, my client Nude over to Flexport Capital, they had a $500,000 advance or something in that ballpark. They had several $100,000 advance out with one of these revenue-based financing companies. And actually another ABL lender had put together this spreadsheet showing the IRR to Nude's CEO. And literally day one, when I started working with him, he sent me the spreadsheet. He was like, John, I think that this guy at this other lender is trying to pull a fast one on us. He's telling us that this revenue-based financing costs 41% a year, but I don't understand. I think the math is wrong. And I sent him a message that said, this math is exactly right. We need to get off of this. And that's when I started looking at other lenders and landed on you guys.
It makes sense. It's tricky. You never want to say that those, lenders are taking advantage, but there is something sneaky about a business model in which, they're assuming that founders don't understand the interest rate math and how it works. And when you factor in daily repayments, the actual effect it has on the company.
Well, and here's what I'll say when it could make sense. it's my last resort, but let's just say here's where it could make sense, is if you literally have a fairly small need for a period of time, you don't want to deal with going through underwriting and putting like an actual lending partner in place on a longer term basis, 12 plus months, right? Go ahead and do that. Know you're paying an astronomically huge APR, but the overall fee impact on your P&L for the year, if you're doing it once or twice a year for, a few $100,000, it may be worth it, right? But if you are, I don't know any D2C brands that are growing that are like that. They're all purchasing more and more inventory every single year because they're growing. And so they need a partner. They need a longer term lending partner that's got a line in place that's got a 12-month term or a 24-month term, because we need that line to be there all the time. We may not be drawn up to the top of the limit at all times, but it needs to be there. If you're going to utilize revenue-based financing over and over and over again, there's better options out there.
Yep. It makes complete sense. Maybe, I guess I don't want to dive too deep on that topic, but it's something that we talk about all the time too, as a competitor to a lot of these merchant cash advances. A merchant cash advance will say that they have a smaller impact to their P&L. Can you talk about, I guess it really goes back into the conversation that we had earlier about P&L management versus cash flow management. Can you kind of weigh the difference between what that looks like on the P&L versus the cash flow?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you this, if you do have a similar average daily balance over the course of a year out on a revenue based financing versus like I don't want to say traditional lender, but like a product like what you guys do, or like a traditional ABL, it is going to have a bigger P&L impact. If anything, if it has a smaller P&L impact, it's probably because the way those things are designed, you're just not going to be able to borrow as much as you might need to borrow, right, at any point in time, because usually they cap you. You can't re-advance until you've paid a certain amount off of a previous advance. And but what I see oftentimes is it doesn't have as big of a P&L impact and in the dollar values perspective, but those brands are like, I need more cash to pay for my inventory. Why don't I have enough cash, right? And so they're paying a ridiculous annualized rate for not even enough capital, right? And so when it comes down to minimizing interest cost on another form of debt, this comes back to why having a CFO versus a bookkeeper is such a important thing. A CFO is going to forecast cash flows, right? Not just profitability. And they're going to be able to help you understand how much debt you should have at any point in time to make it through a certain period. And a good CFO is not going to let you overdraw and pay interest on capital you don't need, or underdraw and run out of cash, right? And so yeah, I mean, that's a little bit about that. But and then it also comes back to a CFO getting the right debt structure put in place at the get-go, right? Because they have forecasted and analyzed your cash conversion cycle and understand this kind of loan is going to be best for your cash gap.
Jon, I'm looking at the clock here and we are just about to time. I'm going to take this thing in for a landing with a couple fun questions.
Awesome.
First is shameless self-plug. So Jon, for everybody listening and they want to reach out to you, where can they find you and Free to Grow CFO?
Yeah, so freetogrowcfo.com is our website. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. It's actually Jonathan, Jonathon, not the A-N. People have been making that mistake my whole life. Jonathan Blair. Also follow our LinkedIn, Free to Grow CFO. And also too, another thing that we have a weekly newsletter that provides simple, actionable tips for founders of growing D2C brands. You can sign up for it on our website. I highly recommend it because it's like a 3 to 4 minute read and you will walk away with actionable tips on how to better scale your business. And you don't even have to work with us to get that. So I highly recommend it. We have hundreds of D2C brand founders that are following the newsletter and give us incredible feedback every single week.
Again, the newsletter can be found on your website or on LinkedIn.
On both, but I suggest just going to freetogrowcfo.com.
Awesome. Well, great. We're always looking to grow. And last question for you, Jon, as you're looking to grow, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, do you have any book recommendations that have impacted you that you'd highly recommend to others?
Absolutely. So actually, I'm a huge nerd. So behind me, you can't see because it's blurred. I have a stack of books that I'm currently working through, but I would say the one that's been most profound for me right now, it's a book called 24 Assets by a guy named Daniel Priestley. Absolutely incredible. It does not matter what kind of business you run. This book will be incredibly impactful. And it's all about how business growth and profitability, it follows the creation of assets. And there are things like brand assets, market assets, product assets, culture assets. And it's all about how to think about your business in terms of creating these assets that behind it will come growth and profitability. It's fantastic.
Awesome. Jon, that's it. We're wrapped up for the formal interview and all of that. So thanks so much. I mean, honestly, I've learned so much just sitting here and thinking through all of the different direct-to-consumer brands that I've worked with in a past life and currently. Man, you're really hitting on everything. It's cool. Thanks for joining us.